Amen. Welcome. Thank you all for being here. Last week, if you remember, we looked at what it meant when Jesus said that he had come to bring division rather than peace. And so the things that we wanted to remember from that are first that God wants us to put him first above everything else, including our family, friends, career, livelihood, anything. Jesus and the gospel come first. And then the other thing is that we are called to confront the divisions of the world head on as people of the gospel, which helps us explain how we can be people of peace and yet still live out our calling to work for God's kingdom by exposing the divisions in the world. Tonight we're going to switch gears, as I've already said, and we're going to talk about the Sabbath, which is one of the most important facets of Christian life, and something that gets talked about a lot, I feel like, but occasionally misunderstood or perhaps understood. And so we're going to look at a lot of passages, as I kind of already said. But first, let's look at Exodus 20, 8 through 11. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So those verses are part of the Ten Commandments, and that's where the idea of the Sabbath really begins in earnest. After bringing Moses and the Israelites out of Egypt, God promised them that he would be their God, they would be his people, and then he gave them these laws. And the Ten Commandments are obviously incredibly well known outside the church as well as inside it. But I think we often have a picture of them as just kind of like simple lists, God says, just remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, and then moves on. There's like 10 single lines. But obviously, as we just read, I read a whole paragraph, and that's from the Ten Commandments. So God takes the time to explain the Sabbath and why it exists right there in the Ten Commandments. And so that's where we begin with our understanding of the Sabbath and what it is. So first, we can see that the Sabbath is about rest. God models Sabbath rest for us all the way back at the beginning of the world. And Exodus reminds us of that. That in Genesis 2, verse 2, it says, "By the seventh day God had finished the work he had been doing, so on the seventh day he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done." Exodus 20 basically quotes the second half of that, quotes verse 3 almost in full. So we have to ask ourselves the question, because this has come up, did God need to pause and rest after creating? Probably not. The scripture tells us that God spoke and the world came into being. It doesn't seem likely that God was exhausted from 6 days of speaking the world into existence. Instead, God rested in order to show his creation how they were meant to live. God has built a need for rest into all of creation. We know that animals and all living creatures need sleep. Fields even need to lie fallow from time to time. And humans need not only sleep, but wakeful rest. We need time spent not working and going. The first thing we should know about the Sabbath, then, is that a need for rest is part of God's plan for us from the very beginning. And Jesus knew that the Sabbath was all about rest. While the Pharisees had created many strict rules about observing the Sabbath, Jesus understood that the true purpose of the Sabbath was for humans to rest in the presence of God. In Mark chapter 2, we get one of the other stories about Jesus having a dialogue with the Pharisees about the Sabbath. And it says, "One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, 'Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?' And he answered, 'Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for us. It's not a commandment we must keep merely because God demands it. Humanity needs rest. We need to pause from the busyness and the efficiency of life and simply be still and know God, to paraphrase the psalm. As we discuss the Sabbath, we need to keep that in mind always. That is the primary goal and purpose of the Sabbath. God knows that we need rest, and that's why he commands us to keep the Sabbath. It's not a commandment for God's sake, but for our sake. So first off, like I said, the Sabbath is about rest. And secondly, we can see that the Sabbath is about trust in God. Notice that in the commandment from Exodus, which I read earlier, God says that no one, not you or your children, your servants, your animals, even foreigners who are in your town, are supposed to work on the Sabbath. Nobody. And then later in the law, in the larger law code that makes up sort of the second half of Exodus and then Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, God takes this thought even further. And in Leviticus chapter 25, God tells Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you enter the land I'm going to give you, the land itself must observe a Sabbath to the Lord. For 6 years sow your fields, and for 6 years prune your vineyards and gather their crops. But in the 7th year the land is to have a year of Sabbath rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. Do not sow your fields or prune your vineyards. Do not reap what grows of itself or harvest the grapes of your untended vines. The land is to have a year of rest." So not only all people, but even the land is to have rest. And God is saying through the Sabbath that we can trust him enough to stop working and rest every now and then. For God to tell the Israelites to let their fields rest once every 7 years, and that on the Sabbath not only they but even their servants, livestock, and foreigners were not to work, was asking for a gigantic act of trust. They had to trust that God would not let them starve, that God would provide for them and their families through a whole year without crops. We too have to learn to trust God with our time and our work. So next I want to read you Isaiah 58, the entire chapter. It's a bit long, but it's really powerful, and I kept trying to cut it down and take bits and pieces of it, but it just doesn't work. You don't get the full force of the argument and what God is saying to us if we don't read the whole thing. So I'm going to break it up a little bit and kind of summarize as we go along, but just pay attention, hopefully, and I think Isaiah 58 is one of the best passages in the Bible, one of my favorites. So I'm going to read it, and I'll break it up, like I said. "Shout it aloud, do not hold back. Raise your voice like a trumpet. Declare to my people their rebellion and to the descendants of Jacob their sins. For day after day they seek me out. They seem eager to know my ways, as if they were a nation that does what is right and has not forsaken the commands of its God. They ask me for just decisions and seem eager for God to come near them. Why have we fasted, they say, and you have not seen it? Why have we humbled ourselves, and you have not noticed?" So the people of Israel appear to be interested in worshiping God. They seek God's wisdom, and they fast, and they humble themselves. And yet God has not noticed them, and they don't know why. But as we continue, God explains why very quickly. So we continue. "Yet on the day of your fasting, you do as you please and exploit all your workers. Your fasting ends in quarreling and strife, and in striking each other with wicked fists. You cannot fast as you do today and expect your voice to be heard on high. Is this the kind of fast I have chosen, only a day for people to humble themselves? Is it only for bowing one's head like a reed and for lying in sackcloth and ashes? Is that what you call a fast, a day acceptable to the Lord?" So now we get to the heart of the matter. They may be fasting, but when they fast, they quarrel and fight. And not only that, but they exploit their workers and they do whatever they want. So God is making a point that the Israelites are not living faithfully if they're simply devoted to God, but not also treating their workers fairly and their fellow Israelites with respect and living in peace. So God has told them what they're doing wrong, and now he tells them what he actually wants from them. "Is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen? to loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke? Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe them and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood? Then your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing will quickly appear. Then your righteousness will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. Then you will call, and the Lord will answer. You will cry for help, and he will say, Here am I. If you do away with the yoke of oppression, with the pointing finger and malicious talk, and if you spend yourselves in behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness, and your night will become like the noonday. The Lord will guide you always. He will satisfy your needs in a sun-scorched land and will strengthen your frame. You will be like a well-watered garden, like a spring whose waters never fail. Your people will rebuild the ancient ruins and will raise up the age-old foundations. You will be called repairer of broken walls, restorer of streets with dwellings. So the kind of fasting God really wants for his people is to get rid of injustice and oppression, for them to feed the hungry and clothe the naked. And that all sounds great, but I'm sure some of you might be wondering, weren't we on a sermon about the Sabbath just a few minutes ago? Well, it's all like, there hasn't been a mention of the Sabbath so far, and I've been going on for all this chapter. Well, now I'm going to finish the chapter. If you keep your feet from breaking the Sabbath and from doing as you please on my holy day, if you call the Sabbath a delight and the Lord's holy day honorable, and if you honor it by not going your own way and not doing as you please or speaking idle words, then you will find your joy in the Lord, and I will cause you to ride in triumph on the heights of the land and to feast on the inheritance of your father Jacob, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. So, at first glance, I think, and to me, the first few times I read this passage, it seems disconnected from everything that's come before it. There's all this talk about justice and proper way to fast, and then all of a sudden God switches to talking about the Sabbath for a couple of verses at the end. Well, the Sabbath is about rest and it's about trust, like we've said, but one part of the Sabbath that's often overlooked is that it is about justice as well. Because we live in a world that demands constant productivity. If you aren't working, you're wasting time. We have readily accepted the idea that time is money. The Sabbath demands that we slow down and stop, even for a little while. And because the Sabbath is meant for everyone, we are reminded that we cannot ignore those people who can't afford to take a Sabbath or have no choice. A man or woman working 2 jobs to support their family, or someone stuck in the cycle of underemployment, often doesn't have the chance to have a Sabbath. They don't get that choice. So Isaiah 58 gets to the heart of what makes the Sabbath about justice. We cannot have our day of rest and yet allow others to be exploited. Oftentimes, in order for us to rest, we rely upon a network of people that we rarely even consider. If we don't want to cook on our day off, we need waiters and chefs and others in the food industry. If we want entertainment, we need people who work in theaters and clubs and so on. These are only some of the examples, of course, but there's all kinds of people who may not have the opportunity to take a rest every 7 days. Isaiah 58 reminds us that we need to see this as injustice, and we need to work so that everyone can have rest. Now, I know just as well as all of you that we're not ever going back to the days when everything was closed on Sunday, and that's not what I'm advocating for. But one of the ideas that's kind of sprung up in the last few years as the sort of Sunday Sabbath culture has faded away is the idea of taking a personal Sabbath, right? That just because not everyone takes the same day off doesn't mean we shouldn't set aside a personal day of rest. And I think that's a good idea, and that's sort of, in a sense, what the Sabbath has to become in a culture like this, because we can't expect everybody to not work on the same day. That's just not how it works. But while it's not a bad idea and it has the right intentions, if we personalize the Sabbath too much, then we forget that it has social implications. Remember that in the Scriptures, the Sabbath was always a communal event. It was never a personal event. And so while Jesus reminded us that the Sabbath is made for man, he doesn't say for each man individually. And that doesn't mean that a personal Sabbath is a bad thing or isn't how we should do it, but it does mean that we need to remember that the Sabbath is for everyone. Part of our calling as Christians is to try and make it possible for everyone to have Sabbath rest. So unfortunately, I don't have all the answers to how we make that happen. There's no magical solution that will suddenly allow every person to take a day off each week. But there are things that we can do. You can volunteer your time to people who have too much on their plates, like babysitting for parents so they can get time to themselves, things like that. You can also vote for laws and regulations that you believe will improve the wages and living situation of those who are struggling to get by. But most importantly, above any other thing that we can do, you and I can join together as the church to provide a place of rest for weary people. Hopefully, this fellowship of believers can offer rest and restoration rather than adding more noise and busyness to somebody's life. That's what we're called to do together, is to offer a place of rest. God has made the Sabbath for all of his people because we need rest. Rest is built into our nature and allows us to recenter our lives on God. And we're not commanded to observe the Sabbath just because God said so, but because God loves us and wants to give us that life-giving, refreshing rest. The Sabbath is an act of faith that says we need to trust God more than we trust in business and wealth, more than we trust in any occupation or any government. So let us rest in the Sabbath, knowing that the Lord has given us this day to pause and rejoice in the restoration of our souls. And let us also continue to work so that all people might enjoy that Sabbath rest. Now I invite you to gather into groups of 2 to 3 and spend some minutes in prayer.